Greetings, everyone. My name is Chris Chalenza, and I'm the James B. Knapp Dean of the Krieger School of Arts and Sciences at Johns Hopkins University.
Hi, everyone. My name is Bill Egginton. I'm the director of the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, also of the Krieger School of Johns Hopkins.
Bill, I'm delighted to be working together with you and the Grass Humanities Institute on this new series on the ongoing crisis in the Middle East. It's got global significance, far-reaching implications, and it's something that is certainly still a part of our world.
I am too, Chris. This has been something we've been working on together for several months and really in conjunction with a very dedicated team of faculty who've been thinking deeply about the implications of the crisis in the Middle East and their roots, but also what it means for college campuses and for education and for communities of learning.
And in this dialogue and in the others in the series, I think what we'll see is something we value in an academic context, which is people bringing evidence and argument and reflecting different positions in the context of the same conversation.
I think that's exactly right. We began this series really at Hopkins with a series of with a panel discussion of Hopkins faculty representing radically different opinions about what was going on, and nevertheless managed to pull off a very large event where people were collegial, listening to each other, and this is what we're trying to do on an even larger scale right now.
That's right, Bill. Well, to close then, why don't we jointly thank the speakers, the moderators, and the viewers for contributing to this academic endeavor. And we hope that all of our viewers join the upcoming sessions and explore the complexities of this pressing issue.
I agree. Thank you, Chris.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us today. I'm Sarah Wildman. I am excited to join you as host and moderator of the fourth in our five-part virtual discussion series called Conflict in the Middle East, Context and Ramifications. This penultimate discussion is titled Human Rights in the Crossfire, Examining the Israel-Palestine Conflict. Our conversation will be wide-ranging and centered on the condition of human rights within the context of the Israel-Palestine conflict, with a focus on allegations of human rights violations, the application of international humanitarian law, and the role of global advocacy in shaping narratives. We will go from the theoretical to the specific and back again and look at historical perspectives. Joining us for this timely and important conversation are Samuel Moyn, Seyla Benhabib, and Hassan Jabareen. We have detailed biographies of each of them on the registration place, but I will give you a short bio for each person. Samuel Moyn is the Kent Professor of Law and History at Yale University, where he also serves as the head of the Grace Hopper College and a fellow at the New Quincy Institute for Responsible Statecraft. Sam spent a decade writing about the history of international law and human rights. Some of his books include The Last Utopia, Human Rights in History, Christian Human Rights, and Humane, How the United States Abandoned Peace and Reinvented War. His most recent book is Liberalism Against Itself, Cold War Intellectuals and the Making of Our Times. I have skipped a title, Sam, I'm sorry, but you can go for his full bio on our registration page. Seyla Benhabib is the Eugene Meyer Professor of Political Science and Philosophy Emerita at Yale University, where she taught from 2001 to 2020. She is currently Senior Research Fellow and Adjunct Professor of Law at Columbia Law School and Affiliate Faculty at Columbia's Department of Philosophy. She has previously taught at the New School for Social Research and Harvard Universities, where she was Professor of Government from 1993 to 2000 and Chair of Harvard's Program on Social Studies from 1996 to 2000. Seyla has made significant contributions to migration and citizenship studies, gender, and multiculturalism. Her books have been translated into 15 languages, and some include The Claims of Culture, Equality, and Diversity in the Global Era, The Rights of Others, Alien Citizens and Residents, Dignity in Adversity, Human Rights in Troubled Times. Hassan Jabareen is the founder and general director of Adalah, an independent human rights organization and legal center. Over the last 30 years, he has litigated scores of landmark constitutional law cases regarding the rights of Palestinian citizens of Israel, including the Palestinian leadership in Israel and humanitarian law, cases concerning Palestinians in the 1967 occupied territory before the Israeli Supreme Court. He has received several awards for outstanding public interest lawyering and top human rights law prizes. Hassan is also an adjunct lecturer in the Faculty of Law at Tel Aviv University, Tel Aviv Hebrew and Haifa Universities. Hassan was a Yale World Fellow, a Senior Rabbiner Law Fellow at Yale Law School, a Research Fellow at the oh my goodness, my German pronunciation is terrible. Hassan, fill it in. The Wissenschaft College.
Wissenschaftskolleg.
Thank you. I can read German, but I cannot speak it very well. And a visiting scholar at Columbia University Law School. He has published several academic articles on the citizenship status of Palestinians. Before we begin tonight's discussion, I would like to remind those of you turning in live to submit questions using the form linked in our reminder emails or by using the QR code you should see on your screens. We'll be monitoring the conversation and do our best to respond to as many as we can during the broadcast and at the end during Q&A. I'd also like to thank the Hopkins at Home team for their production assistance and the Johns Hopkins Krieger School of Arts and Sciences and the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute for their tireless work putting this program together. If you're not familiar, AJHI aims to advance humanities scholarship and teaching at Johns Hopkins and promote literature, art, philosophy, history, and other cultural studies in Baltimore and the wider community. And now, after all that, I would actually like to turn to Sam first and ask him if we even have a definition of what human rights are.
I think so. Human rights are old in a sense. The moral norms that we refer to when we talk about human rights are in philosophy books and in old constitutions. They were consecrated most famously in 1948 by the United Nations General Assembly in the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. And so I actually think there's some agreement about what the content of human rights are. There are lists. The lists sometimes evolve. Major new concerns are taken on board, like, say, gender or war. But what I think is that we need to, I guess, not so much define human rights as understand how they've transformed our politics on a global scale. It turns out when you look that the Universal Declaration didn't have much effect or uptake in its own time. And ordinary people have since claimed it. Now, of course, they interpret the idea of human rights in general and the specific items on the list of human rights in their own fashion. And there can be conflict about how to interpret freedom of speech or immunity from gender violence. But there is a fair bit of consensus. Even when Donald Trump, our old and new president in the United States, set up something called the Commission on Inalienable Rights, he actually agreed with much of the standard list of human rights. And so I think the big question is then, how has this idea changed the way we do politics, argue about politics, and mobilize?
So actually, I'm going to come back to you in a bit about this question of how we apply that to the concepts of war, especially currently. But before I do that, I want to turn to Seyla, because you have said that the language of human rights does not mean that there is a universal definition of human rights. I'd like you to go into the idea that you've written about quite a bit about moral cosmopolitanism and how obligation to kin and family does not exceed that of our obligation to the stranger, and how that philosophical concept helps us understand the application of human rights globally.
Maybe I'd like to begin by distinguishing between moral and legal cosmopolitanism, because moral cosmopolitanism does go back to a universalist core about what we think human dignity is and how human beings should treat each other. I mean, no major religion in the world justifies the killing of innocents, lying at will, carrying false witness. Okay? There are some core universal values, and these core universal values are hard to define. Sometimes they are contentious. They permit different interpretations. But I think when we're talking about human rights, we want to get at the distinction between moral versus legal cosmopolitanism. Legal cosmopolitanism is what Sam was referring to with um, with the fact that human rights become declared, they assume the form of either treaties that nations subscribe to now, or with the Universal Declaration. Note that the Declaration is a declaration, it's not a legally binding treaty. In the same way, let us say that the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights are binding for the nations that subscribe to it. In other words, the distinction between moral cosmopolitanism, which rests upon a belief in the universal dignity of the person and what follows for human relations for that, and legal cosmopolitanism is the establishment of these norms, no matter how contested they are. And they are contested in the sense that are they hortatory? Are they advisory? What is their legal force for non-subscriber, for nations who have not signed on to certain universal declarations of human rights, for example, or maybe in our context more important, but not to get too specific, but for example, many Muslim nations also subscribe to the universal declarations, but they have reservations and understandings where they say that these rights and their tabulations therein cannot contradict the law of Islam and the word of the Prophet. So there are all sorts of ways in which nations subscribe to these rights and then make reservations, derogations. And in that sense, I think Sam's question is a good one. How has the evolution of human rights in the post-World War II period also defined our politics and in particular, what's the relationship between state prerogative, states' actions, and these universal declarations?
So I think this is really interesting in the context of the conflict. And, I'll turn to Hassan now. And I know that Seyla, you can speak to this as well afterwards, which is this question of what does it mean in an ethnic democracy? You've spoken about this context of how they might be defined or defined from country to country differently. Let's say in a Muslim country versus a Christian country or a Jewish one. But if we're speaking of Israel and Hassan, obviously as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, talk to us a little bit about what it means to be in an ethnic democracy and how is it defined? How are human rights defined separately, or are they defined separately between Palestinian citizens of Israel and Jewish citizens of Israel?
Thank you for the question. Thank you for inviting me to this talk. In fact, building on what Seyla said, that the understanding of the human rights and the understanding of the equal rights, we see that it depends and move from country to country based on their culture, based on their national belonging, although there is, as Seyla said, universal understanding for human dignity for all, regardless to your belonging. Now, in Israel defined itself as a Jewish state and thus its commitment for the Jewish people. Now, at the same time, 20% of its populations are Palestinian citizens, but those Palestinian citizens are not equal to the Israeli Jewish majority. And the most important thing is the defining who is citizen and the citizenship law. In citizenship laws in Israel, there is hierarchy between being a Jew and being non-a Jew. And thus, for the Palestinian citizen, for example, they don't have the right of family unification. And this is the only country on the world that limit the family unification of its citizens based on their belonging. However, for the Jewish community, they have, if you are American Jew, you can be citizen of Israel automatically if you immigrate to Israel. And of course, you can come with your non-Jewish members and become a citizen of Israel. There is no problem of family unification. At the same time, beside the citizenship laws, you have the problem of property. 75% of the private land of the Palestinian citizen were confiscated. And a fourth of the population of Palestinian citizens are defined as internal displaced persons. Israel as ethnic state is the only state on the world that the right of equality is not enumerated in its basic laws or its constitution. And it's the only country on the world that reject the notion of that state should be state for all of its citizens. I am the only lawyer in the modern history who stood before a wide panel of justices before Israel's Supreme Court, 11 justices, to convince them that a political party that advocate for state for all of its citizens, it's legitimate to run for the national election. And it wasn't easy case. It was very, very difficult case. And also, Israel is the only state of the world that doesn't recognize its nationality. You are American, you are French if you are French person, you are British if you are a UK citizen, but there is nothing called you are Israeli. One of the cases before Israeli Supreme Court, a Jewish person, he said, I don't want you to register in my ID my nationality as a Jew. My nationality should be Israeli. I am Israeli person. And the Supreme Court said, there is no nationality in Israel called Israelism. Our nationalities are being either Arab or being a Jew. So in this matter, we found that ethnic state of the type of Israel discriminates in all the level of its citizens. So it's not easy to be Palestinian citizen during the war. And yes, if just to have a comment about, to follow with what Sam said about the development of international law after the Second World War and in 1948, and it started that war should be limited, the action of the war limited to human rights aspects. You cannot kill civilians in order to kill civilians. Wars are not based in the notion of revenge. There is distinction between civilians and combatant and should be strict definition and strict differentiation between attacking civilians and attacking combatant. But in this war, we see that all of those notions are collapsed. So the big question will be, after this war, how this war, Gaza war, affect and influence the international law.
Seyla, I actually do want to talk to you a little bit about the peculiarities of Israel as an ethnic democracy or ethnocracy. Do we think of human rights differently in an ethnic democracy than we do in one that is not defined by a religion or ethnic identity?
I mean, I always have learned a lot from Hassan and much agree with him. But I think that we have to deal with the experiential paradox of Israel, not the jurisprudential, not the legal, but the experiential paradox of Israel, that Israel for its Jewish citizens is a vibrant democracy, although in the era of Netanyahu, that needs to be qualified as well, and maybe we will come to that. It fulfills many socio-economic rights that are, for example, not respected, let's say, in many neoliberal democracies, like, human rights, the rights to schooling, and so on. And it's also one of the most contentious democracies. But on the other hand, it's a majoritarian democracy. It is unicameral. What does that mean? There is no House of Representatives and Senate in Israel. The majority cannot be checked. 51, the Knesset is one of the most sort of majoritarian institutions in the world, where the relationship between majoritarian decisions and constitutional rights is not what we expect or what we have found in other liberal democracies. So, as many people know, Israel does not have a constitution. Hassan has a certain understanding of the constitution in his own writings, which actually goes back to something beyond the written document. But for our understanding, if we stay with the simple written document, Israel has a basic law. But the role of the basic law in checking some of the majoritarian and increasingly ethno-nationalist and regressive decisions in the last 20 or 25 years is very questionable. So this is what I mean, the paradox of ethnic democracy. And we have to understand that when Israel is declared as the state of all its Jewish citizens, and indeed 20% of the state of all the Jewish people, and 20% of its citizens are disenfranchised. What does that mean? What bothers me is also in some ways the assumption that being Jewish immediately incorporates me into Israeli citizenship. This is the maximalist Zionist view. No, it doesn't. I have to have a say, a consensus in that belonging. It cannot just be because my mother was Jewish that therefore I am incorporated into this imaginary ethnic community. So the issue is going in two ways. On the one hand, this kind of majoritarian democracy in the experience of the majority of the Israeli citizens is very lively, very active, very contentious. On the other hand, it is discriminatory towards its minority, and it is a sort of ambitiously expansionistic in its understanding of what it means to be Jewish, that one has to have immediate allegiance to the state of Israel or consider oneself a part of it. Why?
It seems to me that there's been shifting terms of this question through the course of the 20th century, now into the 21st. As you mentioned, the rightward trend in Israel. Hassan has written an essay which talked about the optimism of the 90s, which has obviously given way to a very different trend in the current era. And before we turn to that, I want to turn to Sam for a minute, because when you and I were speaking in the run-up to this event a couple of weeks ago, we talked about the fact that often when the conversation comes to the question of the conflict, the debate is the human rights of the occupation and treatment of Palestinians, either in the West Bank and Gaza, or internal to Israel, Palestinian citizens of Israel, rather than looking at the legal status of the occupation or the rights of citizens of Israel who are Palestinian, and the self-determination of the Palestinian people. And I wonder if you can look at that crux of the difference between how one can speak about the human rights in either one of those contexts, debating the human rights of the occupation versus the legality and the legal status of the occupation itself, or of Palestinian citizens of Israel as they currently live and work and take things to Supreme Court, as Hassan does.
Yeah, thanks, Sarah. this has been such a rich conversation so far. I'm a law professor by day, but I always want to avoid being too legalistic in these discussions. And we should remember that while it's enormously significant that Palestinian Israeli citizens of Israel, in a sense, have a formally different legal status than Jewish Israelis because it's a Jewish state, although also a democratic one. We should remember that all states have inequalities, uh, and the United States not least, in the way that citizenship is lived out, uh, whether those inequalities are racial, gendered. There are enormous class inequalities and have been growing. And that's also true of Israel in a neoliberal era. So we always have to combine our sensitivity to what the law says uh, about how people have different status and what their lived reality is. And I think that becomes even more significant when we consider the very different situation, both formally and really, of different kinds of Palestinians. Hassan has done heroic work with respect to the discrimination towards Palestinian Israelis. But of course, there's the occupation, which consists of non-citizens of the state of Israel under an extremely long-term occupation, and in theory, their legal status is murky. According to most outsiders, they're under an illegal occupation. And a prime question would be not whether the rules of that would apply to an occupied territory are followed, but whether the occupation itself is illegal and what to do about it. And of course, there are international courts of the kind Seyla has alluded to, like the International Court of Justice, which have weighed in multiple times on this very question. And then, of course, we have a third category of Palestinians in Gaza. And I think their legal situation is, in a sense, murkier still, because it's very hard to get a consensual answer about the legal status of the Gaza Strip in international law. And of course, there's an actual hot war that's been going on since shortly after October 7th, in which the rules of war that Hassan mentioned have been central to the debate. And so this, let's call it a trifurcation of the kinds of legal status we should be talking about, is really essential, but never forgetting that the law is one thing and the lived reality in the different places is also, essential.
I wonder, Hassan, if you can speak to that lived reality and the question of, and I want us to address October 7th as well, and I'll turn to Seyla for that in a moment. But Hassan, as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, I want you to look at a little bit the aftermath of October 7th and what the effect of the beginning of the war was on Palestinian citizens of Israel, both in terms of being seen potentially as combatants as well as citizens, but also the question of speech itself. How are Palestinian citizens of Israel able to or felt constrained about the way they were able to speak about the conduct of the war?
Yeah, in fact, we can say that really the law after 7th October was changed without changing it through the parliament, was changed through its applicability by the officials, how to apply the law, and through its new interpretation that was affected by the war itself. For example, the Palestinian citizens of Israel found themselves under emergency without declaring that Israel is under emergency. They found themselves that they are not allowed for a very long time after the 7th of October, for the first time, are not allowed to demonstrate for very long time until last March against the war. And without putting that in any law, there is no law prohibit that. The opposite. The law said that they have the right to demonstrate, and the Palestinian citizen became the only group in the world that they don't have the right to demonstrate against the war, although the Israel law allow that. But the interpretation and the application of the rule of law was different. You can say, in other words, the rule of law was suspended. And even the first time that the Israeli Supreme Court denied cases for the right of demonstrations, this is time. In the last 30 years, we don't know about one case, whether for Israeli Jewish community or Palestinian Israelis, that the Israeli Supreme Court denied the right of demonstration. So all of those
Just going to
cases.
ask you I'm going to ask you one question about that. Given we've seen huge amounts of demonstrations in the streets of Tel Aviv since more or less, not exactly at the beginning of the war, there was a calm after the judiciary protests, and then anti-war demonstrations have taken place. If you were a Jewish Israeli versus a Palestinian Israeli at those protests, how are you perceived differently by the state?
This is a great question, and you help me to clarify the issue. If you are a political party and you ask to have demonstration in Arab town against the war, you won't be allowed. But the same political party, if they ask to have demonstration against the war in Tel Aviv, they will be allowed. Meaning we have apartheid based on geographical belonging. Arab towns, Arab cities are not allowed. But in the Jewish places, you are allowed. Now you can ask me, what about Arab Jewish demonstration? That we have many strong Arab Jewish movement against the war, and they usually want to demonstrate, like in Haifa, mixed city, against the war. Arab Jewish equal in this war to Arabs, meaning they are treated as Arabs. So also Arab Jewish movement is not allowed, wasn't allowed to have demonstration in this war. Also, the police found a new thing to indict, not a new thing, they indict like about 160 indictments against Palestinians only because they wrote what they wrote against the war in Facebook. And the indictment is that they incite fear for terror. How? Because if you express your solidarity with Gaza people and you criticize Israel, it's the interpretation for that you support the enemy during wartime. Supporting the enemy during wartime is supporting Hamas in this war. Hamas is a terrorist organization, and thus you support terror. Now, judges and the legal system accepted this new interpretation. Although in the past, before this war, we were allowed to demonstrate against Israel IDF, against Israel actions in the war, and we didn't have those interpretation for the law. So those interpretation of the law became new just in this war. And also the debate about what's going in Gaza for the first time, we have different debate. In the past, we, the human rights community, the human rights lawyers here and in the world, our debate was whether Israel keep the distinction between combatant and civilians, whether Israel exceed its power and kill civilians in a non-proportional way or not. Now, this debate is deleted. We don't speak about it. We are speaking only to stop the war or not to stop the war. This is the only debate now about Gaza war. It's different international debate than we were witnessed in before.
There are a number of things I want to get into with each of the panelists about the question of the moral conduct of the war, but I want to kind of pull back for a moment and actually address October 7th itself. Seyla, is there a human rights framework for how we can see the attack of October 7th? And has that brutality of the atrocities that we saw, did it shift how people saw the morality of response?
October 7th was in so many ways a kind of it created its own state of exception, let me put it this way. I think in the psyche of many Israelis and the psyche of many Jewish people, it was a recapitulation of some form of the Holocaust. No matter how exaggerated that is, it indicated a kind of vulnerability. And the sense was, oh my God, they can kill the elderly, the children, etc. I don't want to go through this. But politically, when you started reading closely, in terms of the politics of the conflict, this moment was a great regression. What I mean by this is that the Jewish kibbutzim, who were the closest to the Gaza border, were actually inhabited by some of the most progressive Israelis who believed in coexistence. And there is a kind of tragedy here. They were not helped by the Israeli government. We all know that the government failed in providing help. But there is another aspect to it, and which is that there were attempts by people in Gaza several times to engage in civil actions of civil disobedience and cross this border, which is really a nothing border as far as I can tell. It's a fence and it's a line in the sand, you know. It's not the ocean, it's not the mountain, it's a line on the sand. And there was an attempt to cross that. Now, I'm going to speak politically. In my opinion, what Hamas did is it set the clock back at least 50 to 60 years. It sent the Jews all the way back to the memories of the Holocaust and enabled the Netanyahu government, which is an extreme government in the history of Israel, to build up this artificial support. And it just blocked the conversation in terms of the human rights framework being the human rights of respecting the human rights of these people who have to live together at the end of the day. I mean, Donald Trump's fantasies are obscene. That's what they are, right? I mean, they are both against international law because it would mean ethnic cleansing, but they also at a level of such political stupidity and naivete that it's almost embarrassing that it's coming out of the mouth of the President of the United States. So I'm sorry if I get a little agitated about this. So the human rights framework, to go back to October 7 made it very difficult to reimagine modes of coexistence, which were, I think, already progressing, which despite all conflict, Palestinians and Israelis have been living together for nearly even more than a century, but let's just look at the state of Israel. So that was a very difficult moment. And I think that what we have to think about now is there a way of a future with dignity for both peoples?
Sam, I think this does get to your questions of what is a humane war? And I know this is the subject of an enormous book of yours, but this war in particular, both the attack of October 7th and then looking at that in the context that Sheila has just laid out for us, but then the response since, I think the question is, around the world, there's been much question about the response. Is there such a thing as a humane response to October 7th? And what have we seen in that context of how human rights has or has not been applied?
Well, the phrase humane war strikes me as like an oxymoron, but to go back to something Hassan said, it is true that there's been an attempt to make war more humane. Now we can debate when exactly that attempt gained traction. I don't think that the Korean War or even the Vietnam War fought by the United States kind of were fought in any way that could be called, some out of respect for the dignity of the human person, in Seyla's phrase. But I think nowadays there are different expectations brought to war, and that reflects, I think, a big set of cultural changes. And now states often brag about their attempts to comply with international law. And that happened notably in the United States, as I've written about, when Barack Obama took over from George W. Bush and promised not an end to warfare, not an end to counter-terrorist warfare, but an end to brutal forms of it, especially torture. And I think a lot of that history is in the background of what's unfolded since October 7th and Israel's response. I think it's fascinating and troubling that Israel did change its own understanding of the constraints on its forces. We have very good reporting about how it changed its rules of engagement in the war as it broke out, and yet it's still a state like the United States that's lawyered up when it comes to warfare. Lawyers are involved in approving actions and strikes. I have a quotation from the New York Times from relatively early in the war, which reads, "Israeli military officials are frustrated that critics don't see that this war is being waged within the letter of international law." And that's in part because a lot of lawyers tried to impose limits, but also because a lot of politicians and lawyers alike understand that saying we're trying to protect civilians helps make people think war is more legitimate. And what I've written is that while that's an important debate, it could distract us from the real solutions. And I think I want to join with Seyla in this regard. Many of us have tried to think in an almost utopian way since October 7th. I agree that October 7th set us back in some respects, but there have been many attempts to imagine political solutions, like a land for all. And in this regard, I think that the sheer focus of the debate around the Gaza war, around whether it's being fought humanely, what it would mean to fight it humanely enough, is noble, but also postpones this really big and difficult question, which is, well, what's the alternative? What's the alternative to an endless occupation? What's the alternative to mowing the lawn in repeated wars? And so this is a way in which international law can, in a sense, just help distract us from the ultimate kind of political causes of conflict and political solutions to them.
I want to actually just note for our audience that mowing the lawn is a term used in terms of this conflict and going back into Gaza again and again. Hassan, I wonder, is this a debate within Israel? One of the things we heard a lot at the beginning of the conflict was that internally to Israel, the scenes of destruction seen abroad and the question of civilian impact was not seen the same way in Israel. And so I'm wondering, as the war progressed, did that change? And did it alter a moral calculus or a conversation internally, either among Palestinian citizens of Israel or among the broader Jewish populace as well?
Right. In fact, the Israeli Jewish community see the war totally different than what the world see it. The world see the war and view it through CNN, BBC, Al Jazeera English, and other media, through the social media. They see the destruction in Gaza. They see that the number of killed persons, civilians in Gaza, and they are aware about the data. The data is shocking, close to 100,000 until now that they were killed or injured, third of them children. And we know that the law of the war say that killing civilians should be the collateral damage. But here we see the killing of the combatant is the collateral damage, and the killing of civilians is the norm. Now, Israeli don't see that. The Israeli media don't bring those photos, those images to the Israeli TVs, to the main Israeli channels. Although Israeli public is open public, they are open to many languages, but the official channels of Israel, they don't bring those images. And during all the war, we didn't hear and listen critique. I think that as I read that they believe that to bring to introduce Gaza people as victims, it might damage the morale of the Israeli to fight and to continue to fight. And it might damage the feeling that they're just on our side as Israeli Jewish community. So this is why you have different debate in Israeli community. At the same time, you have demonstrations against the government and strong demonstrations against Netanyahu. And Netanyahu is losing his popularity. But in fact, he is losing his popularity because there are Israeli hostages under dangers in Gaza, and he is putting them in more risk by continuing the war. So the debate there is different and focus on this questions of Israeli hostages. I agree with Seyla and Sam that 7th of October took us back for a long time. And for it's true, for Israeli Jewish community, they will tell you we don't have experience like the 7th of October since the Holocaust. And the Palestinian will tell you we don't have experience like this, the genocide in Gaza, since our Nakba. But maybe because now, and now I am the last optimistic person in Israel-Palestine speaking, as the last optimistic person, maybe because this war, as political moment, as constitutional moment, no victorious side, no side that can declare victory. Both are defeated. Both they realize that they can damage each other strongly, but they cannot delete each other. So if we cannot delete each other, if we can destroy the life of each other, but we will continue live, maybe this political moment will bring a new question, which different than 48 question and 67 question, how to live together. And I am optimistic that this question will be after the war a leading question. We, the Palestinian and the Jews, try all the violence against each other, all kind of violence to kill the other side, but both still in this land. So what to do? To do is to raise a new question. And I hope that the question that this terrible war will bring is the good question vis-a-vis 1948 and 1967. How to live together and not how to manage the occupation or how to control the occupation or how to control each other.
Seyla, I'm actually going to throw you a question that came in from a Johns Hopkins staff member asking, is Israel held to an unfair standard of human rights given the terrorist threat and even given the context of October 7th?
I mean, there are there are several ways to answer that question. One answer could have something to do with Israel's own self-understanding, Jewish morality, a light unto the nations, Israel holds itself, or used to hold itself, to a high standard. And I mean, this question is also raised. I'm not sure exactly what we are, comparing. I mean, Israel was brutally attacked, and there is a political moment also. And that is a lot of what was done in those first 10, 12 hours of the attack was also committed not just by Hamas, but by a group, the Islamic Jihad. And there are a lot of reports that they were drugged, etc. Now, what does that mean? What that means is that Israel has to behave like a state and not act like a jihadi group, a paramilitary group in its response. Some response was inevitable, okay, but I think it just completely went out of bounds. So in that sense, I don't think it's correct to say that there is a double standard here. I mean, there is the standards that one applies to Israel in terms of its own self-understanding, as coming out of its own tradition of ethics, its constitutional tradition, but also that it has to behave like a state and not like a group of marauding attackers.
This gets to this question I think Sam and I just talked about, which is about asymmetrical warfare and conventional warfare. And it does seem human rights law was set up for a context of conventional war versus asymmetrical war. And how does that differential affect the way we see the conflict either in Gaza currently or just this almost 100-year history between these two peoples?
Well, human rights law wasn't set up for war at all. I mean, it really is a separate body of law that Hassan mentioned called international humanitarian law, which has only been called that since the 1960s, which has gotten, in a sense, reshaped by the idea of human rights and above all by human rights politics and mobilization. And as I mentioned, now we demand more from states when they fight. We place higher expectations on them than our ancestors. And this, of course, places states in a novel predicament, especially when they do something that's age old, which is fight lopsided warfare, or they fight particular kinds of war that are not conventional, including in urban spaces. None of that is new. What's new is that Israel, in this case, is being held to an extremely high standard, but it's one that we should defend. But then actually we have to ask, is that our main goal, just to make powerful actors when they fight war against weaker ones hew to an expectation that they do it humanely? I think that is a noble goal. And as Seyla's indicated, it's not credible to many people that Israel succeeded in meeting that goal. However, the real goal is not fighting at all, and finding the conditions under which there could be a sustainable peace. Now, I would argue that before October 7th, there weren't conditions for a sustainable peace. And this was a wake-up call that I hope Hassan's right, can not just bring us back, but bring us, if you like, back to the future. That's going to be very difficult. But of course, it's true that any powerful state fighting in asymmetrical or counterinsurgent conditions is going to have a lot of trouble. But it's only to the extent we recognize how new it is that we expect like high standards to apply to any kind of warfare.
Do you think, Hassan, and I'm going to meld one of my questions with one that has already come in from the audience, Somebody asked in the audience, can there be a sustainable peace agreement that ensures human rights protections for both Israelis and Palestinians? How can grassroots movements on both sides contribute to building a foundation for human rights and peace? I would add to that, actually, what are the conditions that allow this currently, given the ongoing hot war that restarted again just recently?
Yeah, it's like to continue what Sheila and Sam said that before this war, we didn't see that there is negotiation between the Israeli government and the Palestinian leadership for a new political situation, for reaching peace between the two people, for reach a settlement between the two people, for reaching a compromise. In fact, was no any talk and any negotiation the last decade. And one of the reasons of that Israeli government led by Netanyahu reject the idea of Palestinian state. They don't recognize the right of self-determination of Palestinian people in the West Bank and Gaza. And they don't accept the international norms that apply to West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem, that they perceive West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem as occupied territories. They even in Hebrew, they succeeded to change the language. Like 20 years ago, we were using in Hebrew regarding the West Bank, Gaza, and Jerusalem. In Hebrew, we were saying or the administrative areas. This is the legal term. And some use the occupied areas. Now they change it to a part of Eretz Israel, part of Great Israel, the region. And even they want to change the law. Now there is a bill that no one is allowed to use but the term Yuda and Samira about West Bank and the area of West Bank and some of East Jerusalem. So even the language they succeeded to change based on their ideas that they reject peace with the Palestinians, because any talk with the Palestinian must lead to the question of the right of self-determination of Palestinian people. They don't accept that, and they passed the nation-state law, the basic law, which called the nation-state law. And this basic law rejected the idea that Palestinian has right of self-determination in historic Palestine. And they view that in Great Israel, there is one nation that has the right to exercise the right of self-determination, and it is the Jewish people. So this government, or Netanyahu government, or let us say the Israel right wing, is totally not willing, was no any political will among them, and now there is no political will to negotiate, to reach any agreement. The other side of the Palestinians, you have two groups. One, the official one led by the Palestinian Authority in West Bank, that they are ready for negotiation, and they see that they are must respect the international humanitarian law, even they are not occupying power, but they perceive that some aspect of international humanitarian law, such as armed struggle, apply to them, and they declare daily that our struggle is peacefully, and despite that, Netanyahu perceived Abu Mazen or this authority as enemy. However, we had in Gaza Hamas. Hamas is not like the Palestinian Authority, and they don't have the same rhetoric of Palestinian Authority. They have more militant terminology, but they were also under siege for long time, and the Israeli government doesn't have any talk with them about lifting the siege. And the Israel government made Gaza as the biggest jail in the world. So even Gaza and Israel, you have only talk with Israel, and Gaza is the war and military operation. With Israel and Palestinian Authority, you have silence, no talk, no speaking. About the grassroots, yes, we have human rights community in Israel, Palestinians and Israeli Jews, that I think that we we show that we can work together. We believe in almost in the same principles, and we try like to have our rhetoric to affect the two communities about living together with human dignity. We emphasize the right of every person to live in the country in human dignity, but we are very weak. We are not strong. We are not the dominant group, but at least we have our voice for something that called that we believe that in this country, the two people can live with peace, with equality, and with security.
I'm going to pause it just for a moment and remind the audience that you can use the form to access your email link to ask questions. And there's also a QR code on your screen. We will attempt to answer as many questions as possible. You can direct them to a specific panelist or to the panel in general. And before we do that, though, Seyla, you mentioned in our prep meetings that you wanted to point to Hannah Arendt's essay, and I want to point out that Seyla is a scholar of Hannah Arendt that I would love to listen to for far more than the time we have for this answer. But the essay that she wanted to look to was Zionism Reconsidered, in which Hannah Arendt criticizes the Zionist model of a nation state in Palestine. It predicts the future of the politics of such a state will be dependent on the grace of major world powers, and suggests the idea of a Mediterranean federation of peoples, because this gets to something that Sam mentioned very briefly, which was a group called A Land for All. There's another called Standing Together, both of which look at these alternative models. I wondered if you could look at Arendt and how you would apply her philosophy to what we're seeing now, and even potentially to hope.
Yes. The end of the First World War meant that the end of the Ottoman Empire in this region, and of course, as someone born in Turkey, this is also part of my history. A multinational, multi-ethnic, multi-confessional old empire was dissolved with different imperial powers occupying the land, just as the Zionist ideal of building a nation for the Jewish people was emerging in Europe. Actually, Herzl's idea of the Jewish state is 1890, 1880. So into this vacuum of the decline of multi-confessional empires and so on, which aren't dealt with for Europe, but we can also think about it in the context of the Middle East, comes this model of the European nation state, one nation, one territory, one land, and that sometimes this is called the Westphalian model, but the interesting thing about it is the question of exclusivity. And this model actually dominated the formation of Turkey. It dominated Greece. So it wasn't just unique, but it is a model that is uniquely inappropriate to this region of the world. I have been convinced of this for a very long time, and I know Sam and I disagree about the role of the nation state and the support of human rights. But in the context of Israel-Palestine, I mean, there is the famous phrase by Israel Zankville, land without a people for a people without a land. My God, what blindness. What absolute blindness, right? But this model that is the model of the Zionist means, in effect, that, as Hassan also pointed out, that the people of this region, and there were also Armenians as well as Jews in ancient Palestine, okay, it wasn't just a Muslim Arab community. It was also mixed, but the majority means that you try to construct a state. You try to construct a state model that is uniquely inappropriate to the relationships in the area. And also, you know, there is this broader concept of the Arab nation, the Ummah, that also transcends the nation state. That is the idea of religious community. So Arendt was in this essay in 1945 saying, how is this going to take place? You come to this region of the world with this model of what should constitute a nation state. And I want to distinguish between the idea of a state under the rule of law and a nation state. She means that a nation state that sees the people as a homogeneous nation, okay? Not just the rule of law. And so she said, how is this going to happen? The only way in which this can happen is if the Jewish state becomes dependent upon the grace of the foreign big powers in order to fight against Palestinian Arabs and establish itself. And at that point in time, it was actually the Soviet Union who did vote for the partition and who did support Israel. Eventually, it became the United States. And so she says, no, this is never going to lead to peace. The only model that we should think of is not only, but we should think of the Jewish state as part of the Mediterranean Federation of Peoples. And this idea of a Mediterranean Federation, yes, it has both its utopian and its realist dimensions. It seems utopian because it includes not just Arabs and Jews, it includes Turks, it includes Greeks, it includes Egyptians, But there is a brilliant book by an Israeli scholar, Omri Boehm, The Haifa Republic. He teaches at the New School. He's a philosopher, and he shows that actually this idea of the Mediterranean Federation of Peoples was revived by politicians like Yigal Allon and so on. So it's not irrelevant. Now, what is the realist side of it? And I don't mean to to lecture. It's hard to give up old habits of the professor. What's the realist aspect of it? The realist aspect of it is that peace is a collective goal. And with the Abraham Accords, something changed in the region, except that they all forgot the Palestinians. Whoops, little mistake. What changed in the area? What changed in the area was that some of the major players, like Qatar, the Emirates, Saudi Arabia, eventually accepted Israel as part of the region. That is the meaning of the Abraham Accords, but they all neglected Palestine. So this means that peace can only come through collective agreements of some kind or another. I prefer the idea of the Mediterranean better, but however it comes, it has to be multilateral with many other nations too, having a stake in the Israeli-Palestinian peace.
So since we opened it up to questions, we have gotten in several questions about Palestinian leadership. I'm going to combine two of them, just looking at the time. One was directed directly at Hassan from an alumni of Johns Hopkins that asks, do you think Palestinian leaders have failed their people in any way? And another question regarding Hamas was, where are the Palestinian leaders who are actually interested in peace? And let's pause it there. I think the question for you, Hassan, is differentiating between Palestinian leadership in the West Bank and Gaza versus internal to Israel. But the question is, from this alum, is do you think there has been a failure of leadership on the part of the Palestinians?
Well, first of all, the majority of the Palestinian leaderships, whether you are in Gaza and West Bank or in Israel, the majority all the time, they support the political parties. The Palestinian political parties in Israel, the Fatah, and some serious portion of Hamas and other faction, they support the idea of two-state solution. But they didn't have a partner to speak about it. Like Israel government is not a serious partner for a two-state solution. Now it's easy to speak about the failure of Palestinian leadership for one reason, because the Palestinian people, in in their worst political situation, they are facing genocide in Gaza. Israel also destroying refugee camps in West Bank, and Israel put seriously the Palestinians in Israel under serious oppression to oppress their rights, political rights. And if you look to this picture, you see that the Palestinian leadership failed to give good remedy for the people. And I share also that really the fragmentation between Hamas and the Palestinian Authority added to this failure. And those two groups, Fatah, led by Abu Mazen, and Hamas in Gaza, they didn't realize that they are leading people that they are these people facing the longest occupation since the Second World War and one of the hardest occupation in the modern history. And instead to be together, to work together, they were fighting each other and they created this fragmentation, Gaza entity and West Bank entity. And those fragmentation give Netanyahu government the card to play on those fragmentation. Like one of the reasons that Netanyahu had interest to strengthen Hamas in Gaza in order to weaken the unity among the Palestinian people, in order to weaken the West Bank leadership, in order to come and to say to the international community, well, you want me to negotiate with the Palestinian people. There is no united leadership among them. So this two groups, the leadership of Fatah and Hamas, didn't realize that the Palestinian people was and still against this fragmentation and to create two different political entity, that for Hamas in Gaza the most important is to fight against Fatah, and for Fatah is the most important is to fight against Hamas. Instead, both powers to be against the occupation. They didn't do that. They failed to do that. And this is why, regardless to what Israel is doing, they are a failure leadership.
There are several questions that have come in, and we are very close to the end of time. I'm going to try to combine two as a final question. And obviously, this is the kind of conversation that could really go on for 2 hours and not 1 hour with a very short window for questions. So I'm going to combine two of these questions here. One person asked, Cindy asks, Hamas's attacks on October 7th was a crime against human rights. Every speaker in every event in the series has said so readily, but some speakers refuse to admit Israel has committed any crimes at all. Is there a line that, if crossed by Israel, could be seen universally as crossing a line? And how close close is Israel to those actions? And I will add to that the next question, which came in: how have allegations of human rights abuses shaped the narratives and political strategies of both sides? And I'm going to do a lightning round because we are at a minute, but we'll probably go over slightly and look at that question, because even the prior question is a shaping of narrative. And the question is how these narratives have been shaped and how allegations of human rights abuses have motivated both the global appreciation, or appreciation is really the wrong word here, but the global understanding of the war, as well as the ongoing aspects of the war. I'll start with Sam.
Well, it's been a wonderful conversation. So thanks to Sarah and everyone. I'll just repeat what I've said in the lightning round, which is that in a sense, our moral expectations have changed in the way we think about conflict. And that means that states, aside from acting differently, talk differently. And so it becomes very important in our world to deny human rights abuses, to claim adherence to the law. And I think that's all to the good, but as Seyla points out, there are going to be both internal and external considerations about, how a peace could be available, and there's going to be compromise. And so we have to keep human rights and humanitarian law in mind, but also, I think, take the opportunity of this dreadful moment to, combine the utopian and the realistic, as Seyla beautifully put it.
Seyla?
Well, thank you. Sam, I mean, it's really been a very good conversation. And there is something in political science that's called learning from catastrophe. I mean, think of Germany and France. And I know that the founding of the European Union is not a narrative that can easily be applied in any way to the Middle East, and I'm not talking about that, but I am talking about the fact that sometimes people get exhausted. And I think this is something that Hassan is also pointing out too. This could be a turning point because, as Hassan said, Israel, whether it admits it or not, realized that it cannot exterminate the Palestinian people, nor should it intend to. It wanted a political and military victory over Hamas. This also hasn't quite happened. I myself would very much like to see Hamas disappear as a political entity or transform itself. That's my own position. I don't think it's conducive to peace. But on the other hand, what has been done in this war has, I think, also wounded Israel, and it has wounded Israel's standing in the world. I mean, Sam talked about asymmetrical warfare. And I recall one of the chiefs of staff, American chiefs of staff, saying to the Israeli high command, you are going into a situation of urban warfare. Have you thought about this? And in urban warfare, the laws of war have been brutally violated. And whether the global narrative is manipulated or not manipulated, whether Al Jazeera manipulated or not, the truth of the matter is that hospitals were bombed, schools were bombed, mosques were bombed, and the basic means of living of a people, okay, were destroyed and decimated. It's very hard. It will be very hard for Israel, much to my pain and chagrin, to get over this in the world of public opinion. When peace comes, there are going to be a lot of reparations to be paid to the Palestinian people.
Hassan, I actually will give you this other question that just came in as your lightning round last answer, as we are 3 minutes over. Do you think there can be sustainable peace that ensures human rights protections for both Israelis and Palestinians, given the current climate in the region?
Yes, because the case of Israel and Palestinians is not a unique case in the history. We knew about many people that they fought against each other and they killed each other and they destroy each other or try to destroy each other. But in the end, they reach peace between them. And they are willing among the group, some of them that really to reach peace. And this issue, I am optimistic that it will come. When the question is difficult, when it will come, but this is not unique conflict on the history. And we know many like that. Europe can tell us about the millions of killing in Europe, and despite that, today we have in Europe a very sustainable peace, at least in Western Europe. About what I am worried after the end of the war, I am worried about also the narrative. the changes in international human rights norms. We are having the first time in the modern history, we have televised and alive genocide. We see it daily. We see it in our mobile. We are see it if we enter any place in our life, in the kitchen, in the room, in the toilet. We see it. We see the people. And we are experience that. And we have the first time that state, not guerrilla, state, official state, destroy 70% of homes and houses, destroy all academic institutions, all universities, all schools, all hospitals, all mosques, and the percentage of the killed and injured civilians are very high. Third of them are children. The majority of them are civilians and not combatants. And despite that, this state, that the only time after the Second World War we have state that act in this way. This tells us that the term that we learn about never again after the Second World War seems that is not that strong. Never again meaning that to put the civilians under risk, to kill civilians, it doesn't matter to which reason, by official states, not guerrilla, we see that it's repeat itself and is not, we cannot say that this is Israeli action alone. Otherwise, I won't speak about the international narrative. This state is supported by U.S. Department, the empire of the world, U.S., and supported by the EU, including England. So those states that they portray themselves as the guardian of the international rule of law, they support those actions. So this is why the question that I am thinking about how the international human rights law will be after this war, how our language will be different after this war than before.
I'm
In
going to
this
pause there because we are so over time, and I'm so sorry to do it because this has been an incredibly elucidating and interesting conversation, and I really could take us a very long time to unwind further. I want to thank Seyla, Sam, and Hassan for taking time out of your busy schedules, particularly Hassan, for whom it is very late at night. And being involved in this very important and ongoing conversation about the state of human rights across Israel and Palestine during this conflict. I'd also like to thank everyone, not just anyone, everyone in the Hopkins community for tuning in and listening to our conversation today. For more information about the Alexander Grass Humanities Institute, you can look up their website, which I will not read off to you because it's quite long, and you can register for more free public virtual content, including the next and final discussion in this series, which is April 22nd. Thank you again, and thank you to all the panelists for this very robust conversation that I am loath to cut off, but we are at time. Thank you, all three of you, for joining me.
Thank you.
Bye.